Welcome everybody. Good morning everyone. Hello. We're going to kick off proceedings now. Welcome to Messums West. How many of you are new to this location? Just a few. Okay, so we've got some regulars here. My name is Lisa Anderson and it's my real pleasure to welcome you here to our third symposium for this year. I am Associate Director here at Messums. I joined just a couple of months ago, so it's a really exciting journey so far, and being able to host and provide opportunities for us to have a conversation about the role of art is one of the things that really drew me to this organisation. So, a little bit about more about our symposia. They really are the cornerstone of our programming, and grounded in belief that art is not just something to be viewed. It is something to be discussed, questioned, and actively participated in. We're really passionate about empowering community and inviting collective reflection on the role of art in our society today. We are committed deeply to socially engaged practice and to celebrating the role of creativity in helping us to solve some of the most difficult challenges that we're facing in society. And in that, we recognise artists, designers, makers and educators, and cultural innovators as key to building new solutions. So today's programme brings together some of the most exciting voices in that pursuit, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of our programme. So, we're starting off imminently with James Binning of Assemble Studio with a talk entitled Common Treasures. As a founding member of the Turner Prize winning Assemble Studio, James brings a powerful lens to community engaged design and finding local answers to global problems through collaborative making. Then we'll have a quick refreshment break. Feel free to go back to our restaurant, have a coffee, come back, and at 12 we'll start with a presentation by Zena Holloway. As you walked into this 13th century Thai barn, I'm sure you were awed by the sculptures behind you, and you'll get a sense of the process that went into creating them, the materiality of them, and yeah, you'll understand more about our relationship with Zena. We came to know her through an open call that we put out at the start of the year for artists to respond to the challenge of creating sculpture not using hydrocarbon material. And what you have behind you is evidence of that possibility, so it's really wonderful that we have the opportunity to get under the surface of that possibility through her presentation. Then we'll break for lunch, and the beauty of it being a glorious day is that we get to have lunch in the tent outside, beautifully prepared, very nutritious foods, I think locally sustained, vegetarian, so many of you I think have signed up to have that lunch. We'll get to be in conversation about what we've heard, and then we'll return after an hour for the next conversation by Irene Galou, an expert and visionary from the well-known, celebrated Foster and Partners architecture firm, and she's bringing us insights into sustainable design. So the title for her presentation is Materiality on the Moon. So I'm sure that's taking you to lots of different possibilities. I'm looking forward to hearing what she's going to share with us. We came to know her through, obviously, her firm, so really excited to be able to get a deeper insight into her practice and how that domain of kind of innovation in architecture helps us continue that appreciation of creative problem solving. And then finally, we're going to end with an interactive presentation by Natalia Ernstman from Black Mountain College, an organisation who we've partnered with, and yeah, I think we're going to get more of an educated, engaging discussion about the future for incorporating the learnings from ecology into creating innovative solutions for our world. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to James to start our symposium. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak today. And it's really interesting to be part of, I think, a very varied panel, so I've been looking forward to the other conversations today as well. But for context, I'm part of an organisation called Assemble, or at least have been for the last 15 years. And today really represents a kind of the end of one chapter of practice and the beginning of another, which is as part of an organisation called Common Treasures, which has a similar focus in many ways, but also tries to sort of acknowledge and respond to some of the challenges maybe that working within a conventional architectural organisation presents. But sort of for context, I think later we're going to hear from Irene and Norman Foster's a practice of around 1,500 people, I think. We are a practice of around 15 and have always been fairly stable at that level. So sort of small to mid-scale architectural practice that began as a kind of large group brought together with an interest really in how the kind of direct action of making could allow us as relatively recent architects and students working with very limited resources, small budget, and reclaimed materials to transform in a very kind of physical and immediate way this petrol station into something quite unexpected and surreal in many respects. And so really through the kind of gathering together and kind of borrowing or kind of reclaiming very low value materials, often ones that are kind of not finished parts of the building themselves, or that are usually expressed, but are kind of the membrane layers that go underneath roof tiles to keep the rain out, or scaffolding boards, processed with a lot of care and sort of skill in the making. In this case, passing these kind of curtains through a domestic sewing machine, kilometres of thread over a couple of weeks of process, and then stringing them up as a big curtain, and turning these kind of scaffolding boards into kind of pivoting seats. Through this kind of collective act of making, transforming this petrol station over a period of 8 weeks into something that had a kind of refinement that was surprising given the kind of crudeness that maybe of the materials that went into its production. And that was really our first project. And it sort of led on to an interest in kind of making that developed over the next few years through to larger scale kind of construction projects and sort of thinking about the way, as architects, we might be more involved in a wider range of processes that typically go into the production of the built environment, and that includes an interest in construction, but also in, I guess, the opportunities that we saw in the city, like in that case, in the previous project, the abandoned petrol station, and how something sort of imaginative and speculative on a short-term basis could transform that space. This was a similar site, somewhere where we sort of set up our studios in a semi-derelict building, the one on the right, which had a sort of vacant slab to which you see in my image might be mirrored, so you see on the right-hand side here actually, where we proposed a kind of new build, low-cost studio space that again was kind of constructed a bit like a large Amish barn or something. All the timber sections were sort of sized so that we could do the work ourselves without specialist contractors. Very simple kind of framed building that tenants then moved into and fitted out themselves, so we sort of minimised the costs of construction and gave tenants really the freedom to decide what level of transformation internally the building needed to fit their needs. But again, like with the Cineroleum, whilst a lot of elements of that building are driven by economy and a kind of pragmatism, there's also an interest in how we make architecture that's sort of elevated in spite of its simplicity and low cost. In this case, working with an artist, Molly King, to produce these sort of 1,500 coloured concrete tiles using one very, very simple press. So again, a very sort of basic process where a lot of variety is sort of possible in the production in terms of the colours, and then those colours were just those tiles were sort of given as a batch to the people installing, who then created the pattern. So maybe in contrast to the levels of sort of exacting control we're used to having in architecture, and leaving quite a lot of the decisions up to the people that are responsible for the production of the primary material, in this case the tile, and also the people on site installing those to kind of generate richness to the architecture that we're not sort of fully in control of, set up a framework for. And that kind of attitude then extends to larger scale projects in time. As we move through to sort of 5 years after founding, we won a large competition, for us at least, a large competition, sort of £2.5 million, renovation of Victorian kind of back of house boilers that were the sort of infrastructure behind a kind of public baths in South London. And whilst this kind of project in many ways presented new challenges to how we could retain a kind of active hand in the production of these buildings, there were still opportunities. I think particularly of interest to us was these kind of cast iron tanks and the kind of industrial quality of those, but also the sort of dignity and kind of order that they bring to this otherwise quite informal kind of brick building. And so right from the start there was an interest in how we could use very simple low-cost materials, again in this case corrugated cementitious sheet, and develop a range of kind of coloured stains and finishes that combined with an idea of how to use these very standard elements, so ridge pieces, gutter pieces, and the standard sheets, and to really assemble these sheets into something that felt much more kind of architectural and elegance, really, and sort of elevated through a kind of careful understanding of the composition of these different elements in relation to one another, to make something that was quite crude again in its elements, but quite articulate in the way that it's all kind of put together. And so even on these kind of larger scale projects, where we start to encounter lots of things like risk and kind of, you know, much more kind of complicated long-term legal requirements for the maintenance of these buildings, we're sort of trying to find ways in which we can maybe take more responsibility and exercise a different kind of agency than what's typical for the architect in a project. And it gives us a different kind of control. And whilst those projects really all focus very much on the kind of process of making, you know, I think it was when we started to work at a slightly different scale in a neighbourhood in Liverpool called Granby in 2012. Actually, we started working there. It was a kind of project that's really had a very long, it's been a very long-standing relationship that continues to this day. We really became interested not only in that kind of capacity of making to sort of offer people, I think, a kind of direct connection to processes of change, which can often feel quite removed and remote, and sort of out of the control of the people that are affected by that change. But also an interest in how much money goes into the redevelopment and renewal of places, and how often that money goes in and goes out, leaving very little kind of long-term benefit to those communities, except for the kind of physical change, which itself is often a very turbulent and often disenfranchising process. So this was the kind of condition of some of the streets in the neighbourhood in Granby that we first visited. Actually, this looks like quite a generous kind of common space in the foreground, but in fact it's one half of the street that was completely demolished by the council. And really the kind of history of the area is one in which a kind of incredibly diverse and multicultural part of this at one time incredibly metropolitan or outward-looking city has, you know, grown up at a point in time where Liverpool was prosperous and wealthy, and it was an immensely diverse area. But really, from the 1970s and 80s onwards, following kind of conflict and uprisings between residents and in the face of sort of systemic police aggression and racism, there was a very deliberate effort by the local authority to break that community up and relocate or sort of forcefully move many of the communities that were in social rent housing to other parts of the city and just really dismantle what was perceived to be by the authorities as a troublesome kind of community. But within that context, many residents that owned their homes were able to stay and sort of resist the efforts of the council to kind of fully transform and sanitise that neighbourhood. But in a context in which many of the windows and doors had been boarded up, some of the roofs had been kind of caved in and demolished to kind of speed the deterioration of the interiors of many of these houses. Lots of the residents that stayed, and these are archive photos from one of the residents, Eleanor, of these kind of domestic scale DIY actions really that people started to take to reclaim the streets, to sort of domesticate what was this very abrasive and harsh and in some ways kind of militarised environment made by these shutters and other things. But also to start planting the streets and organising markets and inviting kind of many people that had a long-standing association with the area back in through civic kind of activity and yeah, sort of regular sort of social and civic gatherings. And at the point that we got involved, really, our work was in some ways quite practical. It was both about documenting the work that had already been done by existing residents over a long period of time, which wasn't really acknowledged as being significant or somehow strategic or forward-looking. And I think that's quite common, that there's a sort of quite patronising attitude in the UK often towards community-led initiatives that is quite different, I think, to the seriousness with which those things are treated often in the more European context. And so our work often was just about trying to use our professional standing to sort of validate and formalise really the understanding of the work that had been done over a long period of time to really begin the transformation of this neighbourhood by the residents that had lived there. But it also included strategies for housing and how some of these houses that were in very, very poor condition could begin to be reused, and also strategies for future public spaces and the economic life of the area as well. And so many of the houses were in very, very poor condition. This is a kind of characteristic of the interiors, so they've been stripped of all plaster. Many of what would have been a kind of ceiling has fallen away. The timbers are often in quite poor conditions. Some of these houses have been completely burned out during instances of arson and other things in the history of these buildings that had led to their deterioration. And the strategy really was to sort of take each building as we found it, and to sort of celebrate that variety in each of the houses, so where the ceiling had come down, to sort of treat that space differently, to create a kind of variety and individuality to these houses, even though we had to take a relatively systematic approach to their renovation. And the houses themselves are renovated very simply, right? So white plaster walls, kind of quite pared back interiors. What was described at the time as a kind of builder's finish, often just sitting down with the local contractor and understanding really precisely where the costs were going to be allocated, because in order to justify the renovation of the houses as opposed to the demolition and new build, which was the kind of council's strategy, we had to prove that we could renovate these houses for around £60,000 each, which is a challenge. There are lots of tax breaks that you get if you knock things down and build them new. You don't get those if you're renovating, which sounds insane, but I'm sure there was a logic to it at some point, and that logic is a bit warped now. But aside from these sort of really very simple interiors, I think there was a real interest also in how we could use a small part of the budget to seed something that could invest these interior spaces with the kinds of character that they might have historically had. So if part of the motivation for saving these buildings was that when they were built in the late 19th and early 20th century, when labour was relatively cheap and materials were relatively expensive, they were often invested with extraordinary artisanal skill and care. And the exteriors of the buildings still communicate this with a level of detail in the brickwork that's unreplicated if you go and see a typical brick building built more recently. But the interiors, which had deteriorated so much, had obviously lost a lot of that character. And as part of a sort of pilot program, we set up a new local enterprise, Granby Workshop, which made a whole range of different products, often using reclaimed materials. So kind of going around the backs of all the houses and gathering up much of the demolition rubble and other things that we could find in the streets. And using those to kind of make these special objects that sat at the heart of each home, in terms of these fireplaces, for instance, and also the kind of countertops in the kitchens. When each home sort of has this moment of particular kind of character and personality in the important and central social space of the houses. And that sort of began with the occupation of one of these terraces as a sort of make-do factory, and matured over this pilot program into the occupancy of one of the empty shop units on the street. So trying to sort of reintroduce in some small way, the economic life of the street, which had left when many of the resident communities left, as well as some sort of road bypasses that had really crushed local businesses. And over a sort of 15-week period, there's a sort of open call and really a whole community of people from quite skilled amateur makers through to more kind of professional craftspeople came together to sort of participate in this prototyping of a huge array of different objects for the home, some of which developed into viable products, in this case these kind of pressed plaster ceramic lampshades. So again, trying to think of simple processes that are quite accessible and enable a kind of variety in all the pieces that are produced. To some which were more experimental and a bit less successful, or just too weird for the tastes of the people that are moving into these houses. So you can see these sort of seething roses made using a kind of piping plaster, a bit like you're icing a cake. It wasn't so popular, and it didn't take off commercially either. But yeah, really trying to make these processes quite accessible and quite visible. And another product was using a smaller kind of ceramic press mold. You may have 3 or 4 different molds for the cabinet knobs or light pulls. They could be simply pressed, and then they would be fired in a kind of barbecue with lots of lunch waste or banana skins and coffee grounds to produce these very variegated glazed effects. And so these are really just some videos of this sort of micro factory, really, and all of the different kind of processes that were happening in that neighbourhood at this time. And that was back in 2016, really the start of the renovation of these housing projects. And that organisation over time has developed into an employee-owned business in the local area, Granby Workshop, that has a sort of international reach in some ways that's sort of enabled by its association with our practice and the fact that we can actively support it through developing new products and architectural ceramic elements for use in other projects too. But it's also a really integral part of local projects that are happening in Granby and continue to happen, whether that's sort of new pieces of social or civic infrastructure, like a shared winter garden and residency space that provides a piece of more permanent infrastructure to support this kind of DIY culture and spirit that was so integral to transforming the neighbourhood in the days before we arrived on the project, to sort of work with those residents on the housing elements of the scheme. And it also creates a way in which that community in some ways can capture some of the value that is invested into that local area through the production of new housing and renewal of existing building fabric, which feels really critical. So 10 years on, I think that's still an example of a way in which we try to kind of connect this practice of making and extend it into more established pieces of infrastructure in the places where we're working. And if that Granby project really focuses on a sort of neighbourhood scale of relationships between production and material, and thinking about that local economic benefit at a neighbourhood level, then a more recent project in Luma tries to extend that to a whole kind of territory or bioregion. So we were invited in 2020 to an extraordinary site in the south of France, in Arles, which sits in the Camargue. Some of you might know it, yeah, it's a lovely place if you ever get a chance to visit. To convert this enormous stone train shed, so former kind of SNCF repair shed really, into a space that would demonstrate the potential for the use of many different materials and kind of cultural practices that the area harboured. And so the project really began with a kind of documentation of all the resources that were available in the area and all the kinds of cultural practice and industrial infrastructure as well, that, you know, given all the changes that are going on in the world and the outsourcing of many forms of material production and I guess like, you know, where we get our resources from is increasingly shifting to places that have looser labour laws and enable kind of cheaper access to those materials and resources. This project is really about trying to understand the landscape that still exists in the Camargue and the way that it's changing from stone, which has got an incredibly rich history dating back to the Roman times, more contemporary industries of sand extraction and sand quarrying, which produces huge amounts of clay spoil in this particular geology as a byproduct really of that primary material production, but also the agricultural production as well, in a territory that produces huge amounts of black rice, large amounts of the straw from which is burned every year. If you go there at a particular time of year, actually the atmospheric pollution is quite high, and obviously releasing huge amounts of carbon in the form of this kind of burnt rice waste. But also crops like sunflowers. You know, this is an area where Van Gogh's kind of famous paintings of sunflowers happened when he was living in Arles. So these kind of industrial scale agricultural systems of production that are often focusing on a highly specific part of a crop or product that's being produced, whilst the others rarely have any economic value. And the process of the project really began by using this train shed, a bit like we used those previous sites I showed, as a kind of test bed and working space for prototyping at scale. Lots of different potential uses. So starting with these kind of small-scale tests for called slump tests with the clay to sort of test the clay bodies and what kind of mixes and admixtures you need to make in order to make that useful for a plaster or as a possible compressed block unit for constructing kind of architectural masonry. And you can see that over time then, this site really develops into something that moves from the small-scale samples up to larger-scale prototypes. So extending then to this sort of blue structure in the middle, which is a test for using solid timber. Often if you're constructing larger structures with timber today, you'll glue laminate them or kind of modify them in some way to make those stronger. I mean, we were interested in using the timber in its simplest form, in its least processed form, and finding ways in which we could construct with that material and what it might mean to sort of make an architectural language from that. And similarly then, these kinds of earth tests that you see in the foreground develop into this larger prototype that you see on the right-hand side, testing waste quarry dust from one of the quarries that I showed earlier, which gives it this very pale colour. And that's part kind of compressed in layers and part constructed using compressed earth blocks. And really the purposes of these kind of prototypes and working in this space is so that the kinds of knowledge that are required to kind of put together a building like this aren't siloed, they're not separated out, happening in different kinds of either individual industries where that kind of knowledge is contained and not shared. The function of the site is a kind of big classroom for testing all these things, especially at quite an early stage in the design, enables everybody to kind of come together, and for us as kind of architects and coordinators to understand what knowledge we don't have in our training and to sort of use the knowledge of people with an understanding of these materials or how to build with them and incorporate them into the process. So the whole project really was set up as a kind of 3-year-long training program with the idea that at the end, anybody who's been involved would know how to produce these materials and know where within the region the infrastructure existed to do that, but also local contractors will be able to implement some of these what were at the time for them quite novel techniques in projects that they were working on, and be suggesting those as things that other clients might take up. So yeah, some more images of these prototypes. In this case, also developing kind of paint treatments for the timber structure using algae. There's a lot of green algae blooming in the salt marshes in the Camargue. So not only looking at kind of historic industries, but also new invasive species or kind of bioclimatic issues, and the way in which something like an algal bloom could be a material resource. So it was a mix really of these quite ancient and basic techniques in terms of kind of ramming and compressing earth blocks, one of the oldest building technologies that exists, combined with these much more kind of innovative material applications that were being developed during the project. And alongside those, there's also a sort of more simplistic idea about reclamation and reuse that kind of runs through all of our work. So on the left-hand side, you can see these kind of decorative floor that was made in the kind of main central space of one of the areas that we created in the project. As part of the project, we had to insulate the building to kind of improve its environmental performance. That required taking off all the tiles on the roof, and the ones that were broken were then cut into strips and then laid as a kind of band on the floor, and then cast into a new kind of decorative floor. So trying to sort of use ways of materials kind of coming out of the renovation of the building and sort of put them back into the building as a living piece of history in the same way that we did with those fireplaces in Grandin. Yeah. And you can see the kind of project here with the kind of compressed earth, lower, slightly darker level, and the compressed earth blocks above. So it's got a cool, massive space on the one hand, where it's workshops and labs actually on the top level, and then a kind of arcade, timber arcade space on the other side, which is used for more kind of practical, loud workshop uses. In this case, using all of the black straw that I mentioned earlier, that was developed into an insulation product to kind of pack out the envelope of the building. Often then you need to sort of treat those joints, that we substituted a product that was already on the market, that used an imported reed for a local reed species that's incredibly abundant in the Camargue, which is an invasive species. So again, relocalizing bits of production technology that already existed elsewhere and could be introduced into this context as effectively new local businesses. And kind of in the end, an indigo treatment. So we're running Nîmes in this part of France. Denim takes its name from Nîmes, and the indigo dyeing, so there's another industry here which we ended up using instead of the algae paint. Parts of the sunflowers were kind of threshed and then pressed under heat to release a kind of resin that they have in them to make these acoustic panels that you see, the green panels here. Talks a bit about the tiles, and the ones that are in the poorest condition were kind of broken up and then make this kind of staccato kind of facade. It gives the building quite a lot of character. And there's a final space that is left kind of completely empty. You can see here the kind of rough cast nature of that facade. So you often get very smooth, kind of dressed stone buildings that look very polite in this sort of context, and we want to give this building a bit more of the rougher character that reflected, I think, the kind of physicality of the material processes that went into developing it. And whilst these kind of processes feel maybe extremely specific and niche, I think already in other projects we've been working on, in this case in the south of Korea, in a town called Gwangju, where there's a big seafood industry, we sort of take those similar ideas about starting with a primary resource, in this case shells, and working with a local business to develop a cockle lime block. So the basic chemical makeup of a seashell is very similar to lime. What it is calcium carbonate, and when you burn that, you can make lime, and you can press that using machines that people typically make concrete blocks with to make a much lower carbon local material. So we're interested in sort of using the industrial infrastructure that already exists and not relying on kind of new capital-intensive forms of investment to sort of transform the way that we build. And that was installed in a kind of project in Korea. But I titled the sort of common treasures, and really I think that's sort of these projects have sort of brought us in our practice to a point where we can make these sort of singular one-off projects, and we can talk about the way in which they can contain the potential for wider scale transformations, but without the infrastructure for those transformations to exist, then they tend to stay as compelling stories and interesting kind of narratives and speculations. And I think it feels for me like we've sort of reached the limits of our agency as an architectural practice, and that through a new form of organisation called Common Treasures that we're establishing now, really we're interested in the way that many of these disciplines that often exist in silos, but that are part of the relationships that we've made in these kinds of projects between architecture and industry, between materials and landscapes, and really between processes like planning and land use, and the livelihoods of the people that are producing those materials. And to think about the way that we can work not only at a practice level to produce projects like this, but also how we can start to address on a more systemic level the kinds of policies and practices that are required to make these things more abundant, and I think more everyday and accessible rather than special, which is often how they feel, right? Like that project in Granby was given the Turner Prize because it felt exceptional. That project in Luma, again, feels like something, remarkable in many ways, and certainly going there for the first time felt like visiting Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, but for kind of construction materials. But in practice, many of those things actually are extremely accessible and quite low tech. And the first project that we produced as Common Treasures is a book. We've made 2 volumes. The first one is about land, food, and farming. And I think really these books are a response to the feeling that we have in our work, that very often when we talk about these kind of big issues around climate and sort of environmental change in the UK, or housing and the kind of perma-crisis that we feel like we're in, we're often looking to the government to build 1.5 million homes or come up with some new initiatives that will somehow transform the landscape. Thank you very much. And in our experience, actually, these things are being addressed far more effectively and resourcefully at a local level in all sorts of ways, by people on small regenerative farms, by innovative local businesses working in construction, and without sort of understanding those things as a kind of common culture of practice happening around the UK with relatively limited support currently, it's easy to see these things, I think, as small, specific and isolated, when in reality, I think they add up to a kind of complexity of response that is already in motion and in progress, and is using kind of available resources extremely intelligently and potently. So the first project has really been to kind of collect a series of essays from people working in the field as first-hand accounts of the way in which their work has over a number of years really addressed local issues, and they have sort of developed a practice of responding to what feel like these kind of big, sticky and intractable questions that we're all struggling with and dealing with, but addressing them in the ways that are most specific at the local level. Our hope really is that by bringing all of those things together in one place, we can start to see the relationships between forms of practice in the built environment and in farming, in land use and land management, as something that is much more part of a kind of common project. In that sense, begin to put in place the infrastructure to support a much smaller scale and kind of grassroots type of response to what do feel like problems that the traditional kinds of institution and actors like governments are really struggling to respond to adequately. So that is the end. Sorry, I ran over a little bit. Hopefully that gives you an overview, I think, of where we've been in the last 10 or 15 years, and where we think also, a practice like ours needs to go in the future in order to sort of effectively continue to address some of these things that have been quite important issues for us to date. So if you'd like to know more, we have a website now, called Commenters, where you can also buy the book. It's available on Amazon as well. We need to sell some copies to be able to fund another one. It's a non-profit initiative. So yeah, we'd be very grateful for the support. And I think there's some really special stories in there as well. So thanks very much for coming to listen today. And I'll be around all day, obviously, until the panel ends, so we're happy to if you might come and find me at lunch and one of the coffee breaks to have a chat. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for that fascinating insight into the incredibly generous practice of your studio. I don't think we could have asked for a better introduction into the possibilities of engaging with materials in new ways, in sustainable ways, that are less, like you said, capital intensive and offer a more sustainable way for us to navigate the future. So I'm sure you have a couple of questions, some of you brewing. We've got two there. I think that's enough for now because we want to have sufficient time before we get into our next presentation. So I'll start with the first gentleman right at the back. Sorry. Just behind you and then we follow. Please project.
Yeah, I just want to illuminate this, my question with a simple story. A carpenter was commissioned to do a building in the Blackdowns, and they use a technique of shogi ban, which is blackening larch, which is a very traditional technique, insect-proof, fantastic. And they spent ages burning it all and put it all up. It looked fantastic. For the local authorities to come along and say, no, we don't. You can't have that. You've got to now cover it in £500 worth of a paint, which would stop it burning, even though it has been proven that it won't sort of burn on the outside of a building. It was a blockwork building inside, and it was they painted it. It lost all its character. My question is, how difficult it is, or what techniques have you got to be able to persuade, local authorities or other architectural practices that these materials are bulletproof, and yet they come along and say, no, you can't have it that way. So what ways can you...
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to convert it. I'm at the end of a 14-year planning battle to get a building made in Hammersmith. And often, I think you're in danger of sort of triggering me on the planning front, because I think I think planning is a major issue, right? It's like there's very little accountability and sense, and at the same time, it really has been stripped back so far over sort of 10 years of austerity and other things, so there's just no capacity within the planning departments to engage in any of these things creatively or imaginatively. So I think that the best, interesting, I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago and there was a planner in the audience who said, you give planners far too much respect, if you just do stuff, we have no enforcement powers. So you should just, I was like, well, it's easy for you to say, if I'm an architect and I get the client's gonna, it's, harder to advocate for that. But in our experience, I think it's partly, the effective demonstration of these projects, of these, when you build something, it becomes real. Right, and I understand that what you're saying is that it was built and then the council kind of enforced it, but still I think we've found that often it's through constructing something that everybody can suddenly understand as part of their shared reality that these things are much more able to change. Because up to then, when you're just having a sort of theoretical discussion, it's very difficult to build consensus or to trust. And in the end, what you're talking about is risk aversion. People don't want to take risk or responsibility. So sometimes we've taken that responsibility, like in that green facade I showed, we literally took on the insurance because the contractor wouldn't. But we're happy to do that because we built the thing. We built the mock-up, we know it works and all of this. So I think that's also, it's why we're setting up a different organisation, because these are important questions. And I don't want to spend the next 20 years becoming increasingly embittered by the planning system, which I think in lots of ways, whether it's from building standards, through to 20th century ideas about land use that are very outdated. There are lots of ways that structure at a kind of deeper level what we're able to design and develop in the built environment that are really limiting. So yeah, I mean my colleague Emeka is sort of stealthily placed in the audience, and I think she might have something to say on this.
I just wanted to add that there also are some examples, like in the second book in the series, there's an essay from Barbara Drones, who is just an absolute pioneer in constructing with straw. And I think if you look at her career and the work that she's done in that, you can see a really positive example of someone who has just hit every barrier head on. So she's, for example, written now, after 25 years in her career, she managed to write design guidance that got accepted by the building control and the set of associations who are setting the expectations of building control, which made it so much easier for everyone else who wanted to build with straw. She's also built demonstrator projects as council houses in straw, just to prove that she could meet the same standards. So I think for really specific materials, sometimes you find these really positive, exciting examples, but I guess the problem is that's a whole career. And it took, I know she's been working for like 50 years now, right? She's an extraordinary woman. And all of that effort just to get one material which is incredibly functional, close to acceptable. And yeah, so I guess it's that tension between finding where people have done it and following that versus thinking about how it fits into wider questions, like even how we educate building control.
But it's partly why also, we're less interested in like really novel and experimental techniques, because actually, like when you're dealing with, you can look. I mean, in the UK, not many people know this, but the sort of Homes for Heroes program in the early 20th century, lots of those houses were built in cob, in earth. There are lots of examples. The states used to build using natural materials. Those houses exist. They don't have damp issues. If they're well maintained and other things. So in some ways, it's also about not being so experimental that you're able to go back and sort of reconnect with a kind of culture of building that we can demonstrate is robust, because buildings like this still exist, right? But the kind of modernism sort of created a bit of a rift between those forms of materiality and the kind of ones that we're maybe looking back to in some of these construction processes, but trying to also combine them with new kinds of material knowledge. So the second question is, and I'll answer it quickly as well.
Going back to your Granby Urban Renewal project, I was fascinated by the variation finishes of the fireplaces that were installed. Could you provide any detail on how those were actually made? Were those made in reclaimed material?
So I mean the process for those, and I guess it's a sort of principle that we were quite interested in, more generally, is the way you can sort of, rather than trying to sort of control all elements of a process, try to sort of establish really a kind of framework for making, that there is a sort of enough in place that the outcome is, and sort of a degree of quality is assured, but that there are still decisions to be made by whoever's making it, whether that's a skilled artisan or a labourer on site. And in the case of the Granby fireplaces, I mean, they're incredibly basic. They're basically a kind of mould made from a few bits of plywood screwed together. They're made in 3 parts, so 2 legs and a top. And the process for making those was to really go around the neighbourhood with a flexi tub, or go and pick stuff out of there, build the skips, break up the rubble a bit, so bits of bricks, slate, pour them into the mould, mix it with pigmented concrete, but sometimes that can be pigmented just with grinding up brick dust or reclaiming mortar. And then, they're all different because the materials that are going into them each time are different. But it's certainly not the case that we sort of start with each one and like, right, this one, we'll do a little sketch of where the colours are going to be. They're quite fluid processes. So I think we're quite interested in that as a kind of practice, really.
It was the individuality of each fireplace that really struck me. It wasn't something just churned out on a kind of production line. It was totally unique.
Yeah, and that became a very important principle of the products that Granby Workshop makes now. You know, that every product is different by design, but using processes in a systematic enough way that they can be low cost. Otherwise, we're just making kind of quite verified, expensive objects, which wasn't the intention for that project. So, yeah, thanks for the question. Thank you.
Keep on creeping towards you. Thank you so much, James. Thanks for those great questions. We were lucky enough to show some of those Granby materials at Messums a couple of years ago, so we're going to keep in conversation with the fantastic work that you guys do. And for those of you who have questions for James that you didn't get to ask, we're going to have a final Q&A panel at 3:45, so please do stay for that. And now it's time finally for a break. We've got about 5 minutes to do whatever you need to do, and in the meantime we'll be setting up for the next presentation. Thanks for your attention. See you very soon.